Recently, I had the chance to talk to Ana Xavier from the podcast space on her podcast, The Podcast Space, and we went over some of the new results from the Latino Listener Report from Edison Research concerning the growth of the Latino podcast listening community, as well as the growth of original Spanish podcast content. We talked about Hispanic engagement and bilingual content creation in the podcasting industry, my personal journey of creating 2 podcasts, this one, Focus and Bloom Podcast, and Bloom Creativo. And we also talked about other strategies and mindset tips to help other creators in navigating the podcasting landscape. Thank you, Ana, for having me on your podcast. I'm Yesenia, your video podcast and marketing coach, and this is Focus and Bloom Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
It's National Hispanic History Month. And so here in the US, we're celebrating all things Latine. This episode is no exception. And so in this episode, we're going to be delving into how engaged are US Hispanics in the podcast world. If your business is looking to expand into the Latine market, should you add a Spanish podcast? Or will listeners find a way to you into your English content? Or also, if you're a bilingual podcaster, are you struggling to find your identity? Which one should you pick? And if you've been paralyzed by inaction because of imposter syndrome, you definitely need to listen to this episode. So as a multilingual professional myself, I wanted to delve into these topics. But I felt like even though I do speak Spanish and I grew up in next to Spain, I felt like I wasn't really qualified to talk exclusively about this. So I invited my friend Yesenia Bocanegra because she's a bilingual podcaster and coach. And she's going to be talking about her journey into creating not only 1, but 2 podcasts, her Focus and Bloom podcast and Bloom Creativo. So we ended up recording these podcast episodes before the latest Latino podcast listener report came out. So we focused a lot on the content strategy, mindset, and practical tips to help you stay on track. So before we delve into the conversation, let me share with you a few stats that we didn't touch on, but I think are important to consider no matter your journey if you're in the US. So since 2020, monthly podcast listeners among US Latinos increased 52%. And that's compared to only 14% in the general US population. So it's a substantial increase. A lot of that has to do as well with YouTube, and we delve into that into the episode and what actually has changed. Now, if you're listening and thinking, well, I have a podcast in English, and why is this relevant? Why should I listen? Haha, great question. So basically, the same report mentioned that 23% of US Latinos listened to one English language podcast in the last week. So, they are listening to English content, and Latino podcast listeners are more likely to be entrepreneurs. So if you're targeting entrepreneurs here in the US, it's absolutely something that you need to consider. Then this report also highlighted that nearly 70% of listeners said that they listened to another podcast advertised on another show. So there's potential for you to grow through feed drops and collaborations with other podcasters. And I like this percentage. Over half, so 60% said that they did gather more information about a company or product that they heard first on a podcast. What that means is that excellent news if you have a sponsor, or if you're thinking about approaching a sponsor and you know already that you have a big population of US Latino listeners. Before we delve into the interview, I want to talk about 41% of Latino weekly podcast listeners shared that they listened to a Latino host podcast in the last week, which means that if you're thinking about maybe doing a transition to a Spanish-speaking podcast, or if you want to do both, like Yesenia does, you absolutely need to consider that. And so, obviously the best time to release a podcast was yesterday, but these stats give you confidence that if you're wanting to transition and try new things, it's absolutely important to do it now. So, I'm not going to bore you more with details and stats. If you want to read more, the full report, the link to access that will be in the show notes. So make sure that you go to those. And of course, lastly, introduce myself. If you haven't met, hello, I'm Ana Xavier. I'm the founder of the podcast space. This podcast is the place where you come to get unstuck, to elevate your podcast journey, and to learn about things in podcasting that not everyone's talking about. So if you haven't, please make sure that you subscribe to the show and share it with a friend. Talk to me on social media where you can share with me your ahas. I love reading them and obviously replying to you too. So without further ado, let's get into the podcast episode with Yesenia Bocanegra.
Welcome to Hispanic Heritage Month at the podcast space.
There you go. Thank you. Thank you for that. Oh my God. I was so excited to have you. I was like, yeah, and I'm like going to throw in some Spanish and practice. And then my brain's like, no, girl, we're not doing this.
It's the time.
My gosh. I gotta be honest, I am so excited for this conversation because you and I have been talking about, doing something together, collaborating. I love your content. I love that you do content in 2 separate languages, in English and Spanish, and you have 2 separate communities, and just the content you put out there is just such high level that I'm just always amazed at what you do. So I was like, we have to collaborate 100%. So I am really thrilled to talk about this and also like to let you shine and share your wisdom with our community. So so tell me a little bit about when you're thinking about, content. You and I talk about how as a creator, you have an identity, right? Like when you're talking in content in English and Spanish. And I mentioned this to you. I was like, it's like you have double personality. You light up. You're just talking in such a different intonation is so interesting. And so I only talk in English for my community anyway. But how do you navigate that? Like, do you feel like you have 2 identities or it just flows through you?
That's so funny because it feels different when I'm thinking and creating content in one language versus the other. If I've been creating content for one particular language longer than the other, and I start, like let's say I've been doing Spanish for quite some time, and then now I'm picking up again doing more content in English. My brain just goes like haywire, like, oh, wait, what language am I doing right now? And vice versa. So, I mean, I guess that happens. But the strategic way of all of this is there's a lot of trial and error, a lot of testing, because it's, like you said, it's 2 different audiences. My English speaking audience is mainly located in the United States. My Spanish speaking audience is mixed within the United States, Spain, and Mexico. So I've got 3 very different locations. So there's a ton of testing and seeing what is resonating with each audience, and just going back and forth to analytics, going on YouTube and going on Captivate and see what episode is performing the best, and like if I'm finding some sort of trends in my own content. So there's a lot of that happening behind the scenes. I do enjoy doing it, obviously, because otherwise I will not. It's a lot of work. I'm not going to deny that one single bit, but I really enjoy it because it's a way that I'm giving back to my own community. I was born and raised in Puerto Rico. I lived there until I was 26. I've been here 11, 12 years in the States. So I always wanted to do something, whatever that might be, that would give back to my community. So I think being able to create content in Spanish is a little bit of a small way for me to do that. And I've been very happy with the results that I've been seeing, and just how people are receiving the content, and it just keeps me going, and I really enjoy it.
Yeah, and your Spanish podcast actually was featured was topping the charts multiple times, and I was like, hell yes, Yesenia, that is amazing. So that was cool.
That was definitely unexpected. It went so, according to some of the data that I found from like in the past year, some of the bigger markets in Spanish-speaking podcast creators is in majority is Spain, followed by Argentina, and then Mexico. So those were my 2 goals, like Spain and Argentina, for me to hit the charts. And then within 3 months of airing the podcast last year, it went ahead and topped the charts in both Spain and Argentina. And it goes and shifts throughout different countries in Latin America. But like, oh yeah, this is exciting. So it's a little bit of a vanity metric for sure, but it's like, oh yes, it's there.
Yes, well, you see that you're creating traction in what you're doing, and as Spotify is releasing data and pretty much showing that, yeah, like the Spanish content consumption is increasing year on year. Should people consider creating content on their own language? Like, that's something that you have to determine if it makes sense for you as a creator to go across the pond and think like, okay, do I want to create content for Spanish speaking communities? Like, for you, what was the decision? How did you make that decision?
That decision was almost 10 years in the making. Because, well, actually less. So in 2015, I started my YouTube channel. At that time, I was just focusing on photography, mainly fashion and portraiture at the time. So I started my YouTube channel because I was working with another photographer who was doing YouTube. And I'm like, well, I need to do that. So I started. And right away, I was like, oh, should I do it in Spanish? Should I do it in English? Should I do it in both? Should I translate? So it's always been in the back of my mind. And I remember a few years later, I saw another photographer, also a Puerto Rican, based in New York, and he started creating content in Spanish. I'm like, oh, I'm seeing a trend here. So I'm like, well, maybe I need to. So I started creating content in Spanish. I would mix it around a little bit. So some of the content would be, I would create a video in English and I would do that same version in Spanish, or maybe dub it in Spanish, and then, or maybe just do some subtitles in Spanish. And I got some traction. I was very happy with that. But again, a lot of work. And I did not have a strategy of what I was going to be creating and why I was going to be creating any of the videos. So it took, yeah.
No, go ahead. Then I'll wrap up with what I was thinking.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I took a pause for many years, and then last year, I went on I had a coaching call, and she said, like, "Why are you not creating content in Spanish? Like you have here that you said you're multilingual. You're not taking advantage of those skills." I'm like, okay, you're right, and I had already been thinking about it. Some other people would ask me why I wasn't creating content in Spanish. I'm like, you know what? Universe is pushing me to create content in Spanish. Let's do this again.
That is funny. And so a lot of times people, and I love that you were earlier providing a few options of alternatives, like you can dub, you can put subtitles, like you don't have to create the content from scratch if you don't want to do it, which is clever because, again, like so many people listen to the content and there's a lot of time requirements on that. So tell me a little bit about the strategy, actually. Like, for you as multilingual, were you looking at the content and thinking, I just want to replicate the same content? Were you looking at maybe thinking, okay, how will this resonate what I know about, my community, from teaching, from, experiencing?
So initially, no strategy. It was just a matter of, I had an idea and I would create it, and then I would create its Spanish version. But starting last year, when I decided to start with the podcast, I figured, well, let me just start with the beginning. So everybody, wherever we are in terms of our career, we need to start somewhere. So I'll meet my audience there at the very beginning and see how that resonates. So I started talking about very basic very simple, basic marketing and video and podcast type of content to see how that would resonate with people. And then I would start seeing trends occur in both my content in English and Spanish, where maybe if it was too basic of a concept, it wouldn't perform as well in English, but that similar content would perform well in Spanish. So again, going back to having very different audiences. So like even right now, I feel like my audience in my YouTube channel in English is more like intermediate, or has a little bit more of an experience, and it's more tech driven, versus what I'm seeing right now in my audience in Spanish is more beginner, freelancer. I need help figuring this out, that kind of thing. So I really did not want to just create one thing and copy it in another language, because I was going to get bored with it, period. I don't want to hear.
That's such a good point. Yeah.
I didn't want to hear myself. And I have some people who are also bilingual following me for a very long time. So I want to provide value for them in either language. So whatever language they prefer learning in. So those were two big key decisions for me that helped me determine, if I was just going to copy and replicate another content in another language, or if I was going to create content and create something different, which adds more to the whole thing of it takes time to create content in multiple languages. But again, it goes back to being able to get back and enjoying the process, right? Like when you're starting out your business, you have all these ideas and like you're in this phase of like discovery, right? You're excited about what you're doing and you're very hopeful for things to go well. So you just want to learn, right? You're like a sponge. So sort of that's where my mindset is, where when I'm creating that type of content, I'm just kind of thinking of the younger self of me when I started my business in Puerto Rico. Like I need help. I want to learn from somebody. So that's sort of the story behind that.
Okay. That's interesting. And something that we're going to do is talk about a little bit about how your identity shifts from creating content in your native language versus creating content in English or vice versa. And you and I both were talking about imposter syndrome and how it shows up really differently. And do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because we were both freaking out in a way. We're like, oh my God, we want to talk about this.
Well, we were talking about imposter syndrome the other day, and we were just referencing different examples. One from a client of mine who was now shifting to adding content in English, and she had said something to me, and I'm like, no, don't say this. You're belittling yourself. Like, no, you forget about it. Just show up with your accent, however, just show up. The important thing is having your content. And then like maybe 2 days later, I had an email for my return client that wanted to do a project that I know I can do. But immediately I got that email, I just put up a wall. Like, I don't know if I can do this. Like immediately, imposter syndrome wall right there. And it's like, wow. It's like one moment I am like helping somebody and like telling them, don't worry about this. You got this. You can do this. I know she can. And then a few hours later, I am like just putting myself down. It's like,
yeah, and then funny enough, like after that conversation, I was doing a presentation about podcasting here in Dallas, and I nearly fainted on stage because I started the presentation 3 minutes in, and suddenly. So as a non-English native speaker, I had for years this fear of like, what if I don't know the right word to say? And this all stems because I did radio in Portugal. And so in my head, like what they drill into you is like, there's no silence in radio. And if there's silence, like something's wrong or is like pause for dramatic effect. And so in my mind, I was like, there must be no silence. And so in that moment, my brain comes in and there's this like quote that is whispered into my ear by, my imposter is like, what if you forget every single thing about this presentation? And I almost shut down and I almost fainted within 1 minute because I started freaking out. And I was like, no, I know, absolutely. But then I'm like, what if?
Oh my gosh.
It was so strange. And this was about podcasting, something that I've been talking about like for years. I can talk about this like with no preparation whatsoever. And for some reason, I freaked out so much that like, I was like, I couldn't breathe. And it was really hot in the room as well. So that didn't happen.
Well, you are in Dallas.
True. Like, it was AC.
Sorry.
But yeah, we weren't outdoors. But it was so wild to me how, like, you and I were talking about imposter syndrome. And within that day, I guess it got, like, in the subconscious of my brain. And it just lingered there. And so then I got myself together and I made fun of myself. And kind of how ridiculous it was. And I was like, oh, I'm glad y'all stayed. And, and so like it was the best presentation ever. But like it shows up so much in podcasting where we don't show up, where we don't send emails, where we don't email organizations to partner up because we feel like as hosts, we have an accent or, like we just feel less than. And I just recorded a podcast episode on like the fake it until you make it. And I feel like as multilinguals, we fall so much onto this trap where we feel like our identity cannot isn't enough, right? Like our experience, maybe we have a world of experience. Like I've worked in Portugal, in the UK, and in the US, but somehow I still feel like I have to go and like pick my awards and pick my like whatever in order to justify like, oh yeah, like, okay, maybe I'm worthy of it. So how does your imposter syndrome show up on your end normally on your podcast and your creative journey?
Just, it's like, I think it probably shows up with comparison. Like, you know, maybe I'm seeing this person on Instagram. It's like, oh, they have it. Oh my gosh. And they're saying they're doing this, or they have these amount of downloads, or like they got the sponsorship or whatever. I'm like, I don't have that. And it's just, there's something that comes in. It's like a shower of just stress. That comes in, and then I'm like, okay, I need to stop. And like I stop, like I do like the thing that where you don't get the notifications, their notifications for a certain amount of time. Not following them, but like
you mute them.
Yeah, that one. So I'm like, okay, I need to refocus on me. But it happens. I mean, it's just it's not easy running a business, and it can often be very lonely. So of course, it's you against you, right? So it's a lot of things could come in, and maybe you're not super, maybe, you know, podcasting involves technology. So maybe you're like, oh, I'm not good with technology. So that kind of freaks you out, and then you feel like you can't do it when you can. It's just, it might take you a moment longer than another person, but don't ask me to do a difficult math problem, because I'm not going to do it. Now, tell me how to troubleshoot a camera. I'm like, okay, give me that thing.
Yes, I agree. Yeah, and it's so funny because like we can get in our way, and if we would never talk to other people the way we talk to ourselves, right? And in my mind, like one of those things, like again, it's always like the insecurities we have, and like one of the insecurities I have in my, apart from like, will I forget the freaking word? Now that happens in Portuguese. When I'm thinking Portuguese, sometimes I'm like stressed when I have to be interviewed in Portuguese. I'm like, oh my God, like, I don't know if I'm going to be able to remember a word. But I mean, we're literally doing this podcast right now in English, and it is so ridiculous. But the way that it shows up for me is when I'm editing, like I'm thinking that like that pause that I was thinking about the word, that like trying to find the best word. Again, I speak Portuguese, Spanish, French. I can understand Italian. And sometimes my brain is like, know the exact word in another language. And I'm like, not helpful right now. And to me, when I'm listening back to it, when I'm editing, I was like, oh my God, I thought it was like the longest time. In my head, it was like 5 seconds, and it was just like 2. And I'm like, this is ridiculous. So apart from like turning off the notifications when like your imposter shows up when you're podcasting, how do you navigate that imposter, and how you like kind of tell yourself like, this is, no, we're not, I'm cutting this off, I'm timing myself out? Like, how do you do it?
I think it depends on when in the season, if you will. What I do is I just shut the door to my office, and I do something completely different, just so that I can disconnect myself from it. Because I also I enjoy so much what I do that I want to keep it fun, and I don't want to like hammer myself down and just because of imposter syndrome. So sometimes I just separate myself from what I'm doing and take a break and see what I need to do to like recenter and remind myself that I've done cool things. Like I need to remind myself, and actually was going to do it today. I meant to do it before this conversation. I have this big Post-it. I wanted to do like write down all my wins for the year, like just really big. Nice. as a reminder, like you did this.
Oh, I like that. I have my notebook of achievements that I always talk about. Nice. Like I always take notes of like things that happen, and it can be as simple as like, you know, someone buying a course from me, or like me, I don't know, like collaborating with a brand that I've been wanting to do for a long time. And then you just like go through the book and you're like, holy cow, I've done all of these things. And then on the digital side, I have a little like folder which has screenshots of messages that listeners sent out or like comments on, like posts that I've done. And so that helps me get really centered in the fact that like it doesn't matter, like I'm still creating impact, I'm still creating change. And so that's how I do it. So so you take those like very visible, almost like a mood board of like, but like of achievements.
Right.
So earlier on, you touched on this and I was like, oh, I want to dig deeper. So you were talking about having fun, and we're going to go into having fun and identity. And do you have more fun when you're creating content in one of the languages?
I don't think I have more fun in one or the other because, and I think it might be the fact that although I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, my first language is Spanish. I also grew up at the same time speaking English. So I can easily switch between the two, and I don't have a preference. So I think I don't have more fun in one or the other. I think it's equal.
Okay, got it. All right. Well, but I think it's a good exercise to, like, as a creator, if you're considering creating content in both languages or like determining which one, like really pay attention to how you're feeling. Like, what is the level of excitement? Also, like, what are your limiting beliefs? But let's touch on something that is like identity and how you were raised, because something that I notice is that when I'm speaking in Portuguese, and this is, by the way, y'all, I'm going to have to provide a little bit of context here. So I'm originally from Portugal. I left Portugal when I was 21 after, graduating and working in radio. I moved to London. And so my, forming myself as an adult and all of that was in Portugal. And so, like, there's a lot of things that if you are an adult, your identity kind of, like, gets stuck. And I saw these meme that was really interesting that says something along the lines of, like, when you go back to your hometown, half of you is rebirth like a phoenix, because you kind of like go back to how you used to be. And I find that when I'm going back to Portugal, because in Portugal, and if you actually look on this, it's not just my opinion, like this is how the country operates. Like, I love how Americans are so positive up front. Like, people are super, like they go from the assumption that everything is exciting. They have, like, Americans have, like, these, like, childlike curiosity, which is great. And they're very, like, supportive. Like, you go on the street and they're like, oh, I love your outfit. And you're like, I don't know you, but thank you. And like, in Portugal, people will tell you 7 things they don't love about what you're doing. And so maybe they would go, yeah, that's okay. Or maybe they're like, oh, it's your responsibility to do it well. And you're like, that is not very supportive. And so when I'm creating content in Portuguese for podcasts and stuff, I have to be so careful to not default to that identity.
Interesting.
Because I don't feel like I was always like supportive and like, pumping people up. But because of the context, sometimes you default to these like old self. And I feel like I am way more supportive like here in this context in America than I was back in Portugal. And so I always have to catch myself to not do that. So do you find yourself and you don't have to go like, it doesn't have to be the same, but I always find that I have to be extra cautious in that.
That's very interesting. In my case, I don't know if I have a particular like thing that I'll default. I think that the thing that I would struggle is just, I think that when I'm speaking in English, I try to be more like proper.
Yeah.
And then in Spanish, all the colloquialisms just go out.
Yeah.
And so probably that's why you hear a lot more personality there. Because there's just weird sayings that we have that I cannot translate that because there's just no translation.
So looking into like some data here, because I'm like, oh, let's look into data, two data nerds. We were talking about like how like people are open to consuming both content in both English and Spanish. And I want you to kind of talk a little bit about this because you kind of like, oh, this is really interesting. So let's talk about like how people have preferences and content and things that may, affect them.
So for what I've been reading in different studies, in the United States, at least. So you've got families, you got people who come to the States and were born and raised in their country, in somewhere in Spanish speaking country. But they come as an adult, maybe like in their 20s. So they've already been exposed to a lot of Spanish, and now they're exposed to English. So they might feel okay and comfortable, depending on their level for English. They might feel comfortable in either language. You might have people who were maybe born in their country and coming to the States when they were young. So now English becomes practically their first language. Their friends are speaking English. Their classes are in English. Everything is around English. So they might feel more comfortable with that, but then at home they still have Spanish. And then you have people who might be older and are coming, maybe they're boomers, and they're coming to the States at that age, and their English skills are not as great. They might understand it. They can, go about, but it's not their strong suit. They feel more comfortable in Spanish. So they might prefer reading something in Spanish or watching something in Spanish. So you've got almost like 3 different audiences among that Hispanic and that Spanish speaking community. Personally, in my case, like I mentioned, I was born and raised in Puerto Rico, but I learned how to speak English at the same time because my dad's from New York. So he would always, and even to this day, he still speaks to us in English. So I can switch either way, but it's really a preference or lack thereof, because language isn't necessarily the most important thing, but it's like the content of that, and then also the culture aspect of what that content is bringing. Obviously, if it's the person that prefers English or prefers Spanish, then you've got that. But the gist of it is like the content and then the cultural aspect of it, which is, I think, very cool.
Yeah, because I remember, when was this? I think it was last year in 2022. There was a report organized by, what was this? Oh my gosh. There's Nielsen and there's...
Edison Nielsen?
Edison Research.
Edison's the one that's coming up soon.
Yes. So there's Edison Research, and they started by doing just the regular standard data analytics for podcasters and podcast consumption, podcast audiences. And then they moved into let's look into the Black community. And then they were like, all right, let's look into the Hispanic community. Let's look into women. They have been really segmenting parts of the population. So when you were talking about how really we're looking at different segments, I remember that they were talking about in the study, there were such interesting elements that I think maybe also related across the board, depending on some parts of the population, it may be connected, because they were talking about one of the reasons why some parts of the population were not listening to podcasts it was because they had old cars that were not connected, that didn't have CarPlay. And so, for instance, these people would just listen to the radio because by default, their current setup was not really, I mean, you can connect it with a jack and stuff, but with an auxiliary
right.
cable, but it wouldn't be the default, because it's a little it's not great. If you gotta plug the cable and plug it into your phone and just so you know what I mean? It's also contextual. Sometimes cars that just maybe have been in the family for a long time, right. They're I'm not listening to podcasts because my car isn't naturally set up for that. Right. So there's also I think that maybe there's been a boom in the car industry and all that. And so I read somewhere that it was 49% of Hispanic podcast listeners started listening within the last 2 years.
Well, so you're talking about the way that the podcast is consumed, but to kind of tie that up, recently YouTube. So that Google Podcast is no longer it's closing, right? So YouTube is investing a lot in the podcast industry. And one of the things is for you to be able to consume their content no matter what platform, no matter where, and easily pick up. So if you're watching something on your TV and then you leave, you want to still watch it, you can easily do that in your CarPlay or AirPlay or whatever you need on your car, for example. So that's just one way that the economy, different industries are working in favor of podcasting, which also brings me to another fact. I can't remember the percentage, but Hispanic Latino listeners, podcast listeners, are actually more engaged in terms that they have a higher percentage of viewing video podcasts.
Oh, yes. That's what I wanted to mention earlier. Yes. So I even remember that the study from Edison Research actually mentioned that initially the reason why a lot of people were going, and I had this because I had a listener, she was Portuguese, but she came to me and she's like, I'm listening to your podcast on YouTube because I can have the captions on and actually catch up with what you're saying. So she was actually improving her English as she was listening to me. And again, like I speak really fast. That's a problem. So I understand that she needed the subtitles. But then she messaged me like months and months later. She's like, I can now listen to you without the subtitles. And this feels like a win. But which I was so excited for her. But I think that is really important to see, because I think even in that in the Nielsen report, they were talking about how that actually we're moving away from that. People are not anymore listening just to like either learn the language or get more contextual information. Actually is because they are interested in the topic, which I was like, that's really cool, the transition of audiences. And
well, it's along that same line. I don't know if you are the same, but my guilty pleasure is watching holiday movies. Like, I love watching holiday chick flicks.
Like Hallmark?
Anything.
Okay.
Like from Harry Potter to anything that's cheesy, I will watch it, and that's my thing. But one thing that I've been enjoying over the past, like that I enjoyed a lot last year, was more of these cheesy, amazing movies in different languages. So this is a Netflix. So Netflix, it's not just showing content in one particular language. It's really suggesting content based on the topic. So like
I've noticed that.
Right. So just think of that. That's another example of how like the language isn't necessarily a barrier anymore. Because then now, if we have these AI tools, I know you mentioned earlier you wanted to discuss that, but like we have some AI tools like just YouTube's auto caption. You're already like bridging that gap. And even if you don't know a particular language, you could still find value in whatever they're saying.
Yeah, 100%. And like if you are now looking at, how Spotify is going to be kind of sampling your voice and using it to get into other languages, it's amazing because then you suddenly you are able, like, for instance, I don't know any German, but like I could get my content in German, right? And so people could connect with what you're saying. You can reach so many more people. But you and I were discussing this, how we were like a little kind of like on the verge, because like, well, if, I don't want to create content in Portuguese because I don't think that it makes sense for my business. But like if I just toggle in the future, just that setting that says, hey, okay, like Portuguese. Translate this to Portuguese, I'm going to be so pissed off. It's like translating it in a way where I'm like, I would not use that word at all. Or like, that is like so flat. Like, where's my personality? So that comes across, like, I guess, like at some point as a creator, you have to determine, like, do I want to create reach and just like increase my reach and like be on it like 100%, or do I want to take the time and really maybe assess some markets that I want to create content on? So yeah, there's a lot of food for thought in there. Like, what is your goal, right?
Right, exactly. And then YouTube, even earlier this year, I think they started rolling it out to certain accounts. I don't know if I haven't seen it in mine available. Where now you can add different tracks of different audios to that same video without having to create. I think Mr. Beast is an example. Like, he has his regular channel, and then you've got, I think he has a Spanish channel, and it's translated, it's dubbed. But now, like, you don't have to do double the uploads and double the anything. So it's all added to that same video, that same initial video. So obviously you need to have that feature available, and then you would need to, it's not automated, it's not an AI thing. You need to actually maybe have somebody dub it, whether it's you or you pay for that service. But it's another way to bridge that gap of that language gap.
So I think that we can probably start wrapping up. Was there something that we didn't talk about that you really wanted to like let listeners know about?
I think we discussed a lot in terms of like imposter syndrome, but if you're a content creator or if you're thinking of being a content creator, whether it's in your native language or not, just, show up as you are. You will have an audience that will follow you just when you're authentic to yourself, it's going to show up across your content.
Yeah, I agree. And like, again, like I just did a podcast episode on like the fake it until you make it. And one of those things is like that, like you feel like you're coming from a place where where you're like, quote unquote, lacking and you're not enough. And where, like how cool is it that if you start today and, you are doing podcast episodes where you may have to read or you're still struggling a little bit. And then 2 years from now, like you feel so comfortable in the language, deep, down that route, you can connect with listeners who maybe are doing the same path, or maybe you're trying to break into like a new market. And how exciting it is to just like share the journey, because, there will always be people who, are better than us anyway, but like we connect to people, and I feel like people do business with people. And so like every single facet that like you can talk about, like your personal journey, your personal story will attract a bigger, more engaged audience than just talking about facts and how-tos. If you can weave that, way more powerful.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, Yesenia, it was so good chatting to you and going through like all of these like limiting beliefs that we all have as multilinguals. And just hopefully, like, honestly, I want to say that hiring a coach or hiring a consultant who does have that experience is so important. And you actually do that, right? Like you coach and you work with multilingual podcasters. Yes. So let's plug a little bit the work you do just at the end of this, because why not?
Yeah, so I do video podcast and marketing coach. So whether it's in English or Spanish, I do French as well, but that's not much.
You do? Yeah. What? Okay, all right. Okay, bonjour. We're gonna like start talking French next time. All right.
The next episode, the continuation.
Yes, exactly.
So I coach video entrepreneurs, so small business owners, entrepreneurs on video podcasting and content creation, and how you can use video and or podcasts as part of like your main content to whether it's promote your services, your business, or use that as your lead.
Perfect. All right. Well, that's great. So they can find you online at
focusandbloomstudios.com and also on Instagram, Focus and Bloom Studios.
Perfect. Well, and obviously, like we'll have all the links to all of that in the show notes. I really appreciate you for coming in and having this wonderful conversation that started as a train wreck on my side, but eventually we got there.
Gracias.
So, gracias. Obrigada.
Obrigada.
You also speak Portuguese.
Obrigada,
so.
pouquinho.
Amazing. All right. Well, Yesenia, thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your tips. And for the listener, I cannot tell you how important it is that you keep creating content that is imperfect, that like moves you on your journey a bit, little by little. But like when you look back, it's just such a path that you've been on. Like, again, like keep doing it. And all the resources that I mentioned. And if you want to work with me as well, there will be all the links on thepodcastbase.com/podcast. This will be episode 39. So make sure that you search for that and you share it as well with a multilingual or bilingual creator that needs to hear this, and connect with us on Instagram. I'd love to hear you. All right. I'll see you on the next episode.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Focus and Bloom podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an episode. And while you're there, go ahead and leave us a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback means the world, and it helps others discover the show. And if you want to get your hands on more video podcasting resources, head on over to focusandbloomstudios.com and check out our tools and resources for video podcasters and content creators just like you. I'll see you on the next episode.